The first ever G20 Summit on African soil has wrapped up in Johannesburg, and South Africa is calling it a turning point for the continent and the global south. The two-day summit opened with an unprecedented breakthrough. A joint declaration was issued at the very start of proceedings. This despite US President Donald Trump's boycott. World leaders reached early consensus on the 122-point leaders' declaration. The G20 declaration lays out multiple core priorities for the global economy going forward. It calls for stronger multilateral cooperation and places inclusive growth for developing nations at the centre of the agenda. Leaders have committed to accelerating climate action and driving sustainability, while pushing for debt relief mechanisms to support poorer countries. And finally, it stresses targeted support for small islands and less developed states, acknowledging their unique vulnerability to disasters and economic shocks. South Africa used the presidency to place African and global South priorities at the heart of the agenda. This includes priorities on food security, industrial growth, energy transition, and digital access. South African President Cyril Ramaphosa underlined that shared goals outweigh differences, calling the declaration proof that Africa's voice now carries weights in global decision-making. He reminded leaders that this is the first time an African nation has held the presidency of the world's largest economies. The United States is scheduled to take over the G20 presidency on December the 1st, 2025.
The G20 South Africa Summit Leaders' Declaration is more than words. It is a commitment to concrete actions that will improve the lives of people in every part of the world. More than that, it reaffirms our renewed commitment to multilateral cooperation and our recognition that our shared goals outweigh our differences.
But the summit unfolded against the turbulent geopolitical backdrop. The United States boycotted the event, objecting to South Africa's choice of agenda after tensions over denounced claims of atrocities against white Afrikaners in the country. Other world powers, including India, Europe, China, Turkey, Brazil, and Australia, attended the summit and backed the consensus. At the closing ceremony, Ramaphosa declared the summit a victory for multilateralism and a milestone for Africa. He refused Washington's request to hand the ceremonial gavel to a junior diplomat, holding the handover until equal rank officials meet.
I now say that this gavel of this G20 summit formally closes this summit and now moves on to the next president of the G20, which is the United States, where we shall see each other again next year. The summit is therefore closed.
South Africa's Foreign Minister Ronald Lamola hailed the summit as proof that Africa can lead global negotiation, not just participate in it. The G20 now heads to the United States next year, but for South Africa, this summit will be remembered as the moment Africa didn't just host global powers, it shaped the global agenda. For more on this, we have with us Shaun Duty, who is the Director at Control Risks, joining us live from Cape Town, South Africa. Thank you, Shaun, for joining us.
Thank you.
So the first G20 summit on African soil is now over, with ample focus on key continental priorities. Could this be another catalyst for growth in Africa?
I think so. I mean, I think having the G20 conference here in South Africa, for South Africa, the first African chair to host a conference in Johannesburg, is a great boost for the continent, and I think it can be very good for our economics. I think also for developing nations, it's become, I think there's consensus really that developing nations need to be at the table at these kind of events to discuss the major issues, in particular climate change and debt, as the people in these developing countries that are most affected and negatively affected.
Yes, and Shaun, do you think the world is witnessing a temporary geopolitical churn, or is it a permanent realignment where new blocs and the Global South coalitions are reshaping global decision-making, especially in the wake of this significant US absence?
I think we're definitely moving away from a unipolar world with one superpower to one where China is obviously growing. That is starting to balance out to the United States' influence. But also we have a lot of other rising middle powers like Saudi Arabia, Morocco, Egypt, India, Indonesia, for example. And these middle powers are starting to really push back against the traditional powers like the G7 and forming groups like BRICS, which I think is the best example of where developing countries have got together to try and form something similar to the G7. But that said, while we're going to remain in a multipolar world, BRICS, for example, just doesn't have the influence yet to shape world politics like the G7. But that is changing and their influence is growing. And I think geopolitical structures will be very different in 5 to 10 years.
Yes, and Sean, of course, there are growing conflicts and economic fragmentation across the world currently. Do you think that the G20 should narrow its mandate to core economic issues or broaden it further to stay relevant in the current world order?
Well, I mean, this declaration they had was very broad, dealt with economics, politics, as you mentioned at the beginning, digital access, food. And the G20 really should continue doing this. But I think what's important for the G20 and also for South Africa, for Ramaphosa, for this to, I think, be a successful summit, the key will be for them to actually implement the agreement. Everything that was agreed upon in that 122-point declaration, they have to look at how they're actually going to make that work. Otherwise, it's just a piece of paper, and then G20 remains a talk shop rather than a force for change.
Sean, thank you ever so much for joining us and providing insight. Of course, all eyes will be on the US next, but a moment in African history and a significant moment in global history.
Thank you.
They promised glory. They delivered fear. They shaped nations. They scarred generations. From brutal purges to propaganda machines, from stolen power to violent falls from the throne. Welcome to The Dictator, a series that strips away the myth and then exposes the men behind the tyranny. History remembers their power. Firstpost reveals their truth.